welcome everybody to this week's Social Justice Research Seminar featuring our very own John Blosnich. This is our second to the last meeting for this semester. We will pick things up again next semester at the beginning of the semester. I guess without further ado, I'll turn it over to John.
Great, thanks. Hi, everybody. So the funny thing is, I recognize what today is, and I've been using all of my energy to try to forget what today is. When typically I struggle to remember what day it is. But memory, I realized is, when I was thinking about this morning, is kind of a key thing that's going to come up through this talk. So this is not a research project. It's not a proposal. It's less than half baked. I would put it as these are ingredients that are sitting on the countertop, and we're wondering if we can even make it into something. There's no recipe. So I know folks have probably presented on actual research with results, but here I kind of told Eric, I'm just going to talk about an idea and throw that out there for discussion. So I literally have no results to show you. So for folks, and I'm just an idea. So for folks who know me, and that's kind of what I do, you're welcome. And for folks who are seeing me for the first time, I'm very sorry. So this is a picture of a sculpture that's in Northern Ireland. And it was probably one of the most compelling images I could get when I just simply put in, across a Great Divide. And so this sculpture was made in the early 90s, meant to memorialize the Troubles in Ireland. But I thought it also fit here and what I'm going to be talking about in terms of perhaps an unconventional approach to stoking connectedness among individuals. So a little bit about me. So I trained at West Virginia University. It's where I'm a public health scientist. I did a postdoc in suicide prevention at the University of Rochester. I ended up working at the VA for quite a while, and they turned me into a health services researcher, and now I'm here. So I study suicide mostly. Now, because of my public health training, I take a slightly different approach to suicide prevention, or my focus is slightly different. So I don't really focus on clinical factors for suicide risk. So typically thinking of things like mental illness, mental disorders. Most of my work centers around life disruptions. So sort of the socially based things that can interact with mental illness can, be a contributing factor to mental illness, but I'm really into the socially based things around, the genesis of suicidal ideation and suicide attempt, and ultimately people who die by suicide. But I want to put that out there that this talk will include a little bit about suicide. So 988 is our newly truncated resource for the Lifeline. So I want to start out by talking about quickly, because I know I don't have much time, 3 things about suicide. So suicide is rare. We often think about suicide in a linear path, that people have to first think about it. They make a plan, they attempt, and some people may ultimately die by suicide. And that linear path makes sense. You can't die from something if you haven't, especially something as volitional as suicide, you can't die from it without having some sort of thought about an act that would lead to this outcome, right? So the linear path makes sense. But what I encourage people that suicide itself is a little bit different. There's a different shape to it. And so while we may think of it as linear, it's really sort of a needle in a haystack phenomenon. So you can see here that out of the people who die by suicide, I'm rounding this up, it's just shy of 50,000 in the latest data that we have. You can see there's different phenomena I just talked about, how much broader that population is out of those groups. So in fact, the outcome of interest, preventing suicide death, is less than 0.5% of the people who thought about suicide. And so that is our smallest haystack that we can look for, right, for these needles, versus the 330 million people in the United States, right? So we would think that if we're going to try to prevent suicide death, we'd probably be looking mostly for this, the semaphore, the signal around people who are thinking about suicide, right? But even then, shrinking down that haystack, you're still looking, that needle's getting smaller too, okay? And I guess stop me if you have any questions or anything. I could slide into the suicide 101 thing real quickly and make a lot of assumptions that people know things that maybe they don't, because I've done this for a long time. So please stop me if I do that. So the second thing, suicide is complex. So don't worry, I'm going to go through every single one of these things individually so we have a good grounding for every single one of them. Of course, I will not. And so this is just a slight depiction. It's not even all of the risk factors that are identified in the risk factor literature around suicide. And thinking about there's a difference between risk factors and the outcome. So what we've also learned over time is that because of the very different phenomena, they are related, but they are different. The people who ultimately die by suicide, their risk factors may look different from people who are in the suicidal ideation part of that pyramid that I just showed. So some of these risk factors are also dynamic in terms of where people fall along that risk continuum. But there's a lot of things out there, just to say, to illustrate how complex it is. Now, there are a lot of theories about suicidal behavior. One of the most popular ones is the interpersonal theory of suicide, put forward by Kim Van Orden, who's at U of R, and Thomas Joyner. And so they basically conceptualized suicide risk in three things, because who doesn't love a Venn diagram, right? So thwarted belongingness, thoughts that I'm alone, perceived burdensomeness, that I'm a burden, that once those two things, those sort of thoughts are in place, you get a desire for suicide. And what really activates the heightened acute risk of someone attempting suicide or making a lethal attempt is this acquired capability for suicide. So this rolls up into access to lethal means, habituation to pain, and sort of the habituation to thoughts of death, because suicide is unlike any other cause of death. We are innately wired to survive. People run from things if their life, we are wired to survive. And for 50,000 people every year, that wiring is gone or they've overridden it, and we don't fully understand why or how. So although we've studied suicide for a long time, I mean, this is Emil Durkheim is kind of credited as starting the study of suicide. He is a sociologist. He was not a psychologist in the like 1890s. We've kind of come, hopefully further. I will say we've come far. But I'll show you in a little bit, we're not quite winning as much as we thought we were. So another kind of framework to think about suicidal behavior and outcomes is the integrated motivational and volitional model put forth by Rory O'Connor. And so he kind of, in their group, sort of disentangled this, one theory that's very neat, 3 circles, very easy to understand, but it's very all-encompassing. So it becomes a little bit non-specific when everything can fit into these different circles. So Rory O'Connor's group sort of started teasing out maybe a little bit more of the specific constructs that we could help to guide research. So things like entrapment, defeat, and humiliation. But you'll see, sorry, it's very hard to see hopefully for some folks, but belongingness, burdensomeness, these sorts of losses of connection, these losses of belongingness are still coming through in multiple sorts of frameworks. So there are some threads that guide us despite multiple ways of thinking about the phenomenon, okay? And the last thing I want to say about suicide is that it is unfortunately increasing. So you can see in this, I mean, it's not a steep increase, but if this was to be shown across a longer generation or across generations in the US, so where we are right now here in 2021, 2022, is that our suicide rate is about as high as it was in 1941. So we've had a lot of progress since World War II, and now we're going backwards in the United States. And we've been, and that trend has been happening since 2000, about 2000. And we don't know why. But in 2009, the CDC was becoming increasingly concerned with this inching up of the suicide rate. And so they thought about developing a one-word strategic direction for suicide prevention. So this is the interactive part. So if you have your phones out, what was that one word? So don't take your phone out and try to Google it. Rather, you can use this QR code. And if you go to menti.com, there's a user code right there that you put in, and you should be able to access this and just type in the word that you think was the one word strategic direction for this. So if you're online, go to menti.com and then use that code. 83845291. So you have one response so far, prevention. Connectedness. Longing, thrive. Prevention seems to be winning the day. Empathy. So what I'm not seeing up here are things that we typically think of, but people bring up whenever we think about preventing suicide, which is I don't see psychotherapy, I don't see pharmacotherapy, I don't see antidepressants. Antidepressants are not indicated for suicide risk anyway, but they come up a lot. Okay. All right, so let's see, what was the one word? Lo and behold, it was connectedness. So this is in 2009. You had to dig in the archives at CDC to find this. So this is what they thought of, and this is more of a public health approach to suicide prevention, right? So I want to draw that distinction as well. So not about clinical care intervention, about prevention. So their strategy, this is 2009, so this is, what, 15 years ago, almost, was connectedness. But as you can see from that graph before showing the trends in suicide risk, it's only gone up since then. We saw one slight dip during COVID, which wasn't necessarily unanticipated. During times of sort of larger kind of threat or disaster, we do see these dips in suicidal thinking and suicide attempts. And sometimes if it's prolonged enough, deaths by suicide. So we've seen similar things in World War II. There was a bit of a dip, I think, documented in 9/11. Not really entirely clear exactly why. A lot of people, mostly sociologists, come up with, sort of theories about it creates this national sort of level, the societal level distraction, right? So it interrupts people's thoughts. It's also associated with greater connectedness, people banding together and thinking that we have like a common threat or a common thing that we're now all working against. More people are checking in on each other and seeing how they're doing. So there's all sorts of ways that disaster might lead to a slight decrease or very time-limited decrease in suicide risk and suicide deaths. But that is not a public health intervention. So we're not going to go around creating gigantic societal disasters in hopes that it's going to reduce the suicide rate. But when we think about connectedness, most of the scales that we have, there are a lot of scales about belongingness, a lot of scales about connectedness. A lot of it is about proximity. A lot of it is about kind of spatial. So thinking about schools, places of worship, workplaces, sports leagues, neighbors, right? Or even joining common causes. So a lot of it is about it's contemporary and it's proximal, right? So what I'm thinking and what I've been thinking about is if we have all of the way that we're thinking about connectedness, I think it's great. Join a sports league, that's all well and good. But the thing that has got me thinking of, is there another option to linking somebody spatially, linking somebody more in a contemporary sense, and looking actually towards the past? Could you actually link somebody? Could you stoke connectedness in somebody? And sort of all the related benefits of connectedness by actually connecting them to somebody in their past. And so this has led me down a rabbit hole of genealogy. So I don't know, has anyone done genealogy before? Dug into their family histories? A couple folks? It's becoming more popular in the US. So this is a graph from researchers at MIT who tried to estimate how many people are using DNA based. So there's a difference between genealogy where you would go to a library or dig through records on a website, and then there's sort of the gene based version of this where you give a saliva sample and they create sort of your, almost a genogram, I guess, but they tell you about your ancestry, right? Percentages of descendants. And so you can see here, it has been vastly growing over time, okay? So probably the biggest and most well-known here is Ancestry DNA, followed by 23andMe, and then a small sliver up there of others. So about 26 million people, these researchers estimated, have done this prior to the pandemic, so as of 2019. Now, we've used this stuff, it's just specifically the gene-based ancestry has been used in different ways. So if you're familiar with Michelle McNamara, she was married to Patton Oswalt, and she died before she could finish this book. So this book is called I'll Be Gone in the Dark. And it was her passion project up until the time that she died, of trying to identify who the Golden State killer was. And so it ultimately comes out that they found the killer by using DNA evidence from genealogy websites, of tracking down descendancy, because they actually had DNA from the cases. So they were able to identify this killer using DNA gathered from a genealogy site. Now, this has led to a lot of other, I don't mean to get into that sort of rabbit hole, but uses of genealogy that we don't normally think of. And then probably one of the more common things are people wanting to know about family histories of illness, right? So tracing back your family roots to figure out, well, what were things that I need to be aware of that are in my, my lineage? Because to my knowledge, I'm not sure, I'm up here like talking about this, but I've never done one of these 23andMe things to know if they just give you your sort of lineage or ancestry versus, a risk of something happening based on genetic testing. I don't know if they go that far, but if folks have done it and know, please let me know.
23andMe does family ancestry.
Okay, so they will tell you like you have an increased risk of these sorts of diseases because of, okay, interesting. But any Edward Hopper fans? Olga? So Edward Hopper was a realist, right? Realism?
Yeah.
He's often credited with really, it's not that they're stark, but he's this American artist who a lot of his paintings seemingly capture loneliness very well. So we've used genealogy for forensics, use it for tracing risk for medical illnesses. But what I'm wondering is can it actually be used to in a more targeted way of reducing loneliness, increasing belongingness, and ultimately increasing connectivity. So I'm thinking about this because it's not just an I am question or I'm here because. It also, I think, can stoke other things that are potentially along a path to developing resiliency that stem from these sorts of ruminations when you actually take the person that you're learning about in their context. So thinking about either your ancestors' struggles, either sociopolitically or culturally, and then really thinking about, communality or divergences, because I'll end with this, talking about why this is still a half-baked idea. But again, the thinking being that it's going to, through this sort of experience, they can help to bolster some of these other things that are helpful to a person that when they experience a stressor can call on either gratitude, belongingness, perspective taking, and having some sort of anchor to go to, some sort of tool. I'm not saying it's the only thing, but it could be one thing. And so in thinking through all of this, I'm like, well, someone has had to have done this already. I mean, this is 26 million people have spit in a cup, right? That's not accounting for folks who have done record-based sorts of genealogy. So I'm thinking someone along the way has got to have figured out, like, does this actually improve people's mental health when they do this? And unfortunately, I cannot seem to find anything. So the few things that I have found where they are called out has been in the literature around the health of indigenous populations. And so and this is very predictably sparse literature. But a lot of the studies that I have found in this have really talked about how work with indigenous populations have used genealogy, looking to the past as ways of people connecting. Because a lot of these communities have been absolutely decimated by colonialism. So they've lost a lot of their belongingness, they've lost about what their history was. So this reconnecting part has been a really strong thread for mental health among indigenous communities. But it's, to my knowledge and all the searching I've done so far, which has been probably like a few days worth, cumulatively. I've been thinking about this for a while, but if you add up all the hours and trying to think about all the ways to search for this, this seems to be emblematic of the research I've been able to find currently. But it's not to say it's not related to other constructs out there. So I've also had to, because of a different research project, dig into memory, because we're going to be soon, hopefully, asking respondents about, how they felt during a remembered experience in their past. So autobiographical memory has been something I've been having to become a quick study of. But there are still examples here, even within this literature, which is much more robust, that I haven't really dug too much into, but how family history and ancestry plays into a person's development of autobiographical memory. So their sense of self, essentially, which again, isn't necessarily surprising. So if anyone knows me, I have a knack for like pointing out obvious things, like, hey, maybe we should train like family law attorney folks in recognizing mental distress, because I don't know, they see people in mental distress like every single day. So it's not that any of this stuff is groundbreaking or anything like that, but it's just a different way of thinking about it. And do we think that there's a way that we could just, it's out there already, so many people have done it, can we actually uncover something that we just overlooked because we didn't look at the tool in this way or look at this experience in this way. So where my current thinking is, I'm queuing up a line of genealogists to talk to. So really sort of, I don't do this work, so I don't know what kind of their thoughts are and how they've worked with folks who have hired them to do this. And what there is some literature out there on amateur family history or professional genealogists themselves, but not about sort of when they actually work with someone and say, hey, this person hired me to do this thing. And so thinking about qualitative work to better conceptualize what I think is happening and listening to the people who actually do this for a living and what they observe. And then wondering if there's a way from there to take those concepts, operationalize them in an epidemiologic way. Are we actually going to see any sort of associations between this concept with any of these other sorts of things that we think are out there in a quantitative way? And then potentially doing some pre-experimental work. And then ultimately what I'm wondering is if this could be, an adjuvant to, waxing, philosophic here. So if we could actually do an RCT in which you have a group of folks who are all in treatment for depression, right? And you can flip a coin, and in one group, they keep doing what they're doing with their depression treatment, but they work with someone who's going to help them figure out their family history and do genealogy with them, process that with them. And the other group gets an attention control, right? Carefully crafted. And then you measure the thing that you think that the family history thing would do, which is increase their belongingness, connectedness, their perspective taking, gratitude, do those things actually do they emerge for the group who is able to work with somebody to help them actually walk them through this, right? I don't know. Just a thought. But it can be a tool. So I don't think that this alone is going to be a solution at all. I think there are still it is a support to more core pillars. And one example would be a virtual hope box. So folks are familiar with this. It's an app-based adaptation for folks who are managing suicide risk, suicidal ideation. So the virtual hope box is basically you put things that can distract you, remind you of reasons for living. It's all on your phone, so you can access songs, pictures, things like that. So and I don't know if this is already sort of in play with that. People have pictures of family in there. I'm assuming, I don't know. But is one additional example, would these be elements to put into this virtual hope box that actually maybe have more salience than other things that are included? I don't know. And then the last thing I'm going to end with is this quote from Ancestry.com's privacy statement, which I never thought I would ever end a presentation with a quote so profound as to be from the agreement thing that we all just click on and never read. But this is really eloquent, somewhat foreboding, but quite true. Once discoveries are made, we cannot undo them. So there are a lot of other considerations beyond this, which is kind of why I want to talk with the genealogists of what do you do when you uncover something that is not great news for the person on the receiving end? How do you handle that? So there are like television shows about this. Like I know they're like, I can't remember. He's from Harvard. Henry Louis Gates, is that right? It's like knowing your roots or something. I think it's on PBS, but he does it with like famous people. So it's kind of a curated experience. I mean, to some extent, quite boutiquey. But how does this actually play out when you're working with not rich and famous people? And then other considerations. So you have folks who don't have records for a lot of reasons to trace back. You have folks who don't know their families for other reasons as well. My own example would be my parents. My dad enlisted in the Army, went over to Vietnam, met my mother, married there. So I know one half of my family tree because of my father, because his family had been in the US for quite a while. My mother, I have no idea. Partially because I don't know if those records, I probably couldn't interpret the records, but the other thing is, I don't know how well those records did in a country that was torn apart by a civil war fairly recently, and a civil war after a history of colonialism. So those records just may not exist. I don't know. So there are those other sorts of considerations here that from an equity standpoint, there are some folks for whom this just may not be an option because of just, the records just not being there for, again, many reasons. So this is my last slide. So that was pretty much it. A harebrained idea and hopefully fodder for conversation. Thanks.
Thanks, John.
Stunned silence, love it.
John, this is Mike. I have a question.
Yeah, Mike.
What kind of work is there that follows up with people who have experiencing suicidal ideation, just to understand kind of what are the most common motivators and drivers of that? Just out of curiosity, and do we see any shifts in that over time?
So people who have experienced suicidal ideation, what were the precursors to that, or how did they do over time?
Yeah, the reason why I'm asking is, right, as you were talking and I was listening, I was also poking around, looking at trends in suicide around other countries around the world. And we are clearly high and going up, right, relative to lots of other countries. And it makes you think that there's something what are the big things that are going on? And you had your slide with all the things that you didn't talk about. But it seems like there must be some underlying big drivers. And, I was just kind of trying to relate this to your proposal here of one piece of an answer toward decreasing these risks. So I was just kind of wondering how it fits into the broader context of what we understand about drivers of change in suicidality over the last 20 years is what you showed in your slide.
Yeah, so I think the most common risk factor for suicide will be depression. That is probably the most commonly identified phenomenon on the pathway to someone thinking about taking their life. And some of this, so this is, I'm trying to do this briefly, but what we know about this outcome is difficult, right? Because a person who died by suicide cannot answer us about what happened to them. So we have to, there are longitudinal studies, of course, where we can observe this happening. And then there are things called psych autopsy studies, which try to learn and go backwards and basically interview people who knew the person who died. And both, retrospective and prospective studies have identified that upwards of over 90% of people probably had depression, whether they were diagnosed with it or not, which kind of has face validity, right? If you're thinking about ending your life, you're probably not in a great space. You're probably depressed about something, right? Now, how quickly that can come on for people is, that is up for discussion. So people with long histories of depression versus people who, what they call bolt from the blue suicides, which is, the warning signs that we typically tell people to look for were literally not there for this person. And this person did everything that they could, in fact, to show everybody outside or in their circles the exact opposite of everything else. So it's very fraught to understand what exactly were the things, because it's multi-causal, right? But I think depression will be the thing that is the most cited risk factor for suicidal ideation depression. That in itself is also complicated, because by and large, although most people who die by suicide were likely depressed, whether they were diagnosed or not, the vast majority of people with depression never think of trying to kill themselves. So there again, we sort of have a conundrum on, we think we have a really good path in, but it's still, we've shrunk down the haystack, but it's still, the needles are still getting thinner in that haystack. So Mike, to your point, I think a lot of it being suicide prevention has been around, what do we do for depression itself? There are very few evidence-based interventions or treatments for suicide itself. So we kind of think, well, if depression is our biggest semaphore, if we can reduce depression, then hopefully by proxy, we can reduce suicide. Because some of the things that we have that work for suicide prevention are things that most people would not think would work, like sending a postcard to outpatients. So there's a whole suicide prevention intervention, evidence-based, called caring contacts, which basically kind of gets back to this connectedness thing, but it's sending a follow-up postcard or letter or some sort of contact with someone to say, hey, we're checking in on you. We want you to know that, if you need anything. That works. That's evidence-based. There's also very intensive, what is it, CBT-SP or SP-CBT? So all the way down to multi-session cognitive behavioral therapy for people at acute risk for suicide. It's kind of all over the place.
Okay.
Oh my, I can read. Okay, Sean.
So I was just gonna, this is less of a question, but more of a statement. Have you ever read the book Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari?
Yeah.
So have you guys, I mean, he's one of my favorite authors, but he talks at one point about happiness, right? And kind of trying to figure out happiness for Homo sapiens. And it kind of relates to what you're saying, because one of his thoughts is it biochemical related? Is it dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine? Like, is it biochemical, or does it have to do with a sense of self and a sense of connectedness and a purpose in life?
Yeah.
And he kind of talks about the balance, and it's likely both, like genetics and environmental, right? But I thought, I was thinking about that as we're going through this, because it is an interesting lens to have of, you know, our narratives and the narratives of our ancestors, and how does that sort of connect into our happiness, suicide, and things like that. So more of
Sure.
a statement, but
Yeah, I'll just quickly add that one of the other big considerations is that we know that family history of suicide is also, I think, familial transmission of, I mean, the Hemingways are probably a family that's most famously associated with the phenomena of family transmission. So, I mean, there's also this risk of people uncovering things in their family they hadn't known before. So that's also something that is, you know, how would that play out in a therapeutic setting? I don't know. Yeah. Sarah?
So I was thinking about something that I experienced a few years ago when I went to a conference, and this researcher was talking of, it was a conference on border crossings and border narrative, et cetera. And it was taught, he had done some research on migration patterns from Africa to Europe, right? And what I found was really interesting was the suicide rate amongst those who were migrating from those regions, from Africa, from the Middle East, trying to come into Europe. And I don't know exactly how he determined that these were actual suicides that had occurred, whatever. But it made me think about suicide, right? As something that I hadn't really been thinking about when we're looking at the process of migration and the reasons why people migrate and what happens in that journey. And also made me wonder about studies on suicide and how do we ensure, or do we, that these marginalized populations are also folded into an understanding of why and how suicide happens. So I don't know, you may know more than I do, but I just always am thinking about populations, and because I had never thought about refugees, you know, and the incidence of suicide in that population of folks who are just trying to move from a part of the world where they, you know, living is unsustainable
Right.
to another part of the world. And then suddenly, it was just an alarmingly high incidence of suicide in that population.
Yeah, I read an article in the Atlantic about the Darien Gap,
Oh, yes, I have that.
which was like heartbreaking. I was reading it on a plane. I don't know if like there's something with altitude, but they say like you cry more easily on a plane.
Yeah.
Was weeping on a plane after while reading this article about the Darien Gap, and a journalist embedded herself with a group crossing the Darien Gap, which is a space between Colombia and Panama. So folks land in South America, usually in Colombia, and they try to cross into Panama and make their way up. But the Darien Gap is incredibly hazardous, very, very dangerous. And it's an interesting thing. I'll just say, Sada, that I forgot to mention in sort of all the things we know about suicide, at least in the US, it has historically been a white problem. So suicide has historically been higher among white populations and higher among American Indian, Alaska Native populations, but lower amongst other racialized or minoritized racial groups. That is changing for what we can determine is that there are now elevations happening in those minoritized groups that we have not seen before. Which is really alarming because we haven't devoted as much research into it as we have before. So we're starting even further back, in my opinion. But yeah. Eric? Oh,
sorry.
I was gonna say, grab one of the ones online.
yeah. Sarah.
Hi, Dr. Blosnich.
Hey.
Kind of knowing your wheelhouse and research that you've already done, I know the LGBTQ community and youth are really near and dear to you and what you've already worked on. And I'm kind of wondering if we look at those populations and we think about ancestry, kind of how you think that could inform research overlapping those two.
Yeah, that's a really good question. You know, it's a strange thing because, you know, okay, so I could probably use myself as a case study for this. So during the pandemic, to keep myself sane, I fell down like a genealogy sort of thing. And it all started with an article that talked about, you know, America's gone through this before. That talked about 100 years ago, the Spanish flu in 1918. I was like, oh, like, I wonder how did I have anyone that was, so that sort of kicked off me like falling down this sort of path. But Sarah, to your point, you know, I would wonder, like if when I would find information about a family member who, you know, in the 1930s, never married, died a bachelor, or just never, you know, at a time whenever the norm was for people to, you know, this is the path you would take. So why would this, you know, because there's no way to know that information about your ancestors. And I did, you know, have to check myself many times and be like, you're editorializing, you have no idea what's happening here. But it's an interesting thing for someone to not, this component not being reflected. Like, so I look back on my ancestry and I'm like, this is not known to me except for immediately alive relatives whom I know. And my family are also LGBT identified, right? But I know there were probably people in the past, but I will never know that about them because of the times in which they grew up and just it wasn't a possibility for them. So I think that and I think maybe to your point as well, there are some folks who they're happy to know nothing about their families, based on some of the experiences they've had. And I don't know, I would hope that for folks who have those experiences that eventually there's some, I don't know, reconciliation or understanding is not the word. I don't know what the word would be, but feeling that kind of disconnection into perpetuity to me seems a little unbearable and untenable. So my hope would be that for folks who feel that way right now, like I don't care anything to learn about my family because I was thrown out of my family. And there are many people for whom that is their experience, that over time, you know, that pain becomes manageable and that experience becomes manageable to then again still be curious about, you know, what, even if to a point of what led up to the point where my family experience was like this came from somewhere, right? And I think that it still helps with, I think anyway, in terms of, you know, the meaning making and understanding, just an understanding of experience, I guess. But yeah, it's a really good question. Thank you.
Oh, yes, I have a question. Yeah, kind of follow up to what you were talking about. So this idea of genealogy can then increase like belongingness, or connectedness or something. And I'm wondering, like,
Maybe.
but like, what are they being connected to? Or like, or does it even matter that so long as they feel connected to something that's like protected by here?
That's what I mean, that's a very good question too. That's what I don't know. Is it something that can become this go-to thing of like, I understood this thing, or, you know, when I get super stressed out, I think about these things that my grandmother would say, usually quite profane, but it's like, it reminds me of her. And then I'm kind of like on a different path of like, that stress is then, you know, there's something for me to tether to anchor to that interrupts the process, right? And I get for some folks that just, those pathways aren't there. So it's, for me to say that is it's easy because that's idiosyncratic to me. But for someone who's like, my path, my thinking doesn't go that way. But is it possible that this could be, an, you know, because it is something that is personal, because it's something that can be uncovered, does it become a potential guidepost for someone to create a new path? So, you know, yeah, that connection. It could be anything, I guess, you know.
Yeah, and I think very much along this line, one of the questions I was asking myself while listening to this, because it was so provocative, was, is this going to create a sense of connection to a somewhat abstract, nebulous history, or is it going to create connection to actual people? And I think that, you know, at least in my own work, thinking about suicide, and, you know, I've often thought about the specific network connections that are in existence in the present moment, and the benefit or risk that those connections might give to you. And I'm wondering if in your, is this mostly a perception of connection, or is it is this also a pathway to real either existing relationships that have gone neglected or maybe even new relationships?
Both, I think.
Yeah.
I just read Madeleine Albright's her final autobiography is called Hell and Other Destinations, so killer title. But she talks a little bit about finding it would be her grandmother's journal amongst papers that her father had. And her parents had told her growing up that your grandparents died of old age. And so for a very long time, she never knew that a lot of members of her family, because she didn't know she had Jewish heritage, a lot of her grandmother was killed during the Holocaust. She never knew that.
Mm.
And it only came later in life discovering this when I think she said she was 70 when she found this diary that her grandmother was in her early 50s was writing before she was ultimately taken away and murdered. But she thought about it, she kind of ruminating on how her parents wanted to spare her this. They just told her this thing. Well, your parent, and as a child, you're like, well, that makes sense. Well, people get older, then they die.
Yeah.
But even at that stage in her life, it was changing how she thought about like the path she took. Like but I recognize for her, it's different in an older adulthood stage there's differences in thinking about looking back on your life than if you're 40, 45, if you're 30, if you're 20. But I think it could be either or, like I think understanding how those connections form, if they form, is it to an idea of a person? Is it to, well, now I'm making sense of things I'm noticing in my family? I just don't know. But yeah. Rona, and then go to Shelley.
And then I think
Okay,
we're gonna have to wrap up pretty soon just to let folks get to their next thing. But we'll take the last couple of questions since you've spurred all this conversation.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And I was really drawn to the intergenerational transmission of those narratives. And I know that, there is research on cuentos and talk stories and stuff. And that reminded me of something that I did with my dad a couple of years ago. I found something on Instagram called Storyworth. And it was like a year subscription of each week he would get a question. And I could either they were pre-written or I could, personalize them. And he took this whole year to write down about his childhood and all these different things that I didn't know about him and my grandparents. And so I was wondering how that kind of connects to the other considerations that you were talking about when folks don't have different records to go by, and how and at the end of the year, all of the stories that he wrote were actually created into a book.
Oh, nice.
So we have it. And I feel like that's something that I could pass down to my kiddos, and that intergenerational transmission can happen that way, especially for, cultures who might not have other types of records to back on.
Right. I think that's a great example, and more of a contemporary example of I can hear it from somebody now. I can ask them questions more than I found this document. I don't know what this means. I don't know, to Eric's point, am I reading into it and creating this story about it, and going further afield than I really can, speaking beyond the data, PhD students, right? Versus having someone present, but also, and I think that it's generativity. I'm trying to remember the concept, right? That older adults want to leave something, generativity, they want to leave something. And that it can be even later in life. My grandmother said a leopard doesn't change his spots, but I don't necessarily believe that. Right? Because people do change over time, and that folks can find that their parents, as they get older, do want to talk more about things that they did maybe keep from their kids early on, right? Explanations of things, or just things that they want to share at this point now. We don't understand why, but we might be happy or might not be so happy to get. But I mean, think to Rhoda, how do we understand that? How do we study that in terms of, is it contributing to these things that we think it's contributing to? And maybe it's so obvious we don't need it, but I just don't know. I was really disappointed to not see more of this in the literature, because I'm it'd be great if it was already documented, I have to do it. But I just don't feel like it's there quite in the way that I thought it would be there. Sure.
Well, I'll keep it quick, but my last thing was, what about epigenetics? Have you looked into because there's a lot of literature to suggest intergenerational trauma and epigenetic factors that are, sort of being turned on, genes that are being turned on because of some sort of traumatic experience. Maternal child is probably the most. Have you thought about looking into that?
It's come up in an ancillary way, but what I don't know is how it's used. That's the thing. Like, I think that what I'm thinking of here is in working with someone, it's like, to me, epigenetics might be more about you're a carrier of this gene and this is what this means, and not necessarily about the experience of that ancestor, which would be someone who's putting pieces together.
Sure.
I put together newspaper articles, obituaries, all this stuff to, as best I can do, craft this. This is what this is the traces that this person left, right? And like in social work, the use of genograms, right? And so it is more instrumental to well, let's see who's in the family system. Let's map this family system. You may get stories along the way, but it's less of a, the purpose for which that tool is being used is maybe just slightly different, related, but just slightly different, I think.
That's fair.
So, yeah.
I mean, certainly in practice, use genograms as an intervention, not just as an assessment tool. And you can help families or individuals see patterns and then determine how they're going to disrupt those patterns. So I can see the value for there. I guess part of the thing that when you talked about when things got worse, it seemed like about 2000, and my mind goes to social media and this being connected more by the internet than in person. So my concern with, well, not as a concern, is just, I think it's probably what you were talking about as well as Eric, is it is not giving you a person right there now. And that's the connectedness that, and it's the isolation of being like, can you pull on resiliency from your forefathers? Certainly like Native people, that's often what a lot of their prayers and connection are, and gives people strength. I mean, all of this can give us strength, but and it just feels to me like there's that person here in the present that is important. Not that could be an auxiliary support, do you know what I mean? But
Right, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's, they're not gonna get, if someone is in a heightened state of distress, a birth certificate is not gonna help them, right? To
right.
the person from 100 years ago. But yeah, so figuring out, I think, where this would fit sort of in this and thinking about, but that's the thing, it was like, we think about connectedness, it's here, it's now, it's spatial, but I just wonder if there's an element of, can it be bolstered with looking like taking a wider lens to it? So.
Well, let's give John another round of applause. Thank you, John.